Yeah, one question that I had is, can you maybe describe a little bit you mentioned this at the end, the difference between Casper CBC and currently how the sharded consensus works, or how it's planned in the beginning?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, like, there's multiple different families of Casper, and like, they have the same, like, Casper CBC and Casper FFG have the same name, but like, really, Casper basically just stands for Consensus Algorithm Spearheaded and Proposed by Ethereum Research. Right? These are, like, Casper FFG is like an effort to try to kind of start from something closer to classical consensus and simplify and remodel it to be more like, to be more compatible with a chain-based approach and sort of merge the two, whereas Casper CBC is more of a from-scratch approach that tries to kind of more marginally derive finality from either a chain-based or potentially any other kind of system. So we've gone with what we have now, mainly because it is what was ready at the time that we started solidifying the spec, and we have to solidify the spec and ship something at some point. But we're totally open, as I mentioned, we're totally open to and interested in integrating a kind of basic version of CBC and then looking at kind of other more advanced consensus technologies in the future as they get kind of proven themselves to the point where it's clear that they're implementable and they make sense.
Yeah, I'd agree, and basically the way that I'd say is like the main differences is we have like methodological differences. I'm trying to follow this correct by construction approach and do things in a very kind of disciplined approach, and not worrying about optimization or the number of bytes that things are until the very, very end of the process. Whereas Vitalik is much more driven to implement and deploy something on like a more aggressive timeline, I'd say.
Yeah, the Twitter trolls are telling us we have to ship. Raise your hands if you agree with the Twitter trolls. Yeah.
Everyone wants to ship, it's just a matter of like what, when, and how.
So, I guess talking about shipping, what do you view as the future of Ethereum 1 chain once the Ethereum 2 chain starts? Will it slowly die out? Will we be stuck with it forever? What is the approach for sort of the switch from chain 1 to 2?
So I guess first of all, even before ETH2 launches and becomes usable, there is a lot of work kind of done by hardworking people like Alexei and Elaine and others on the 1.x front that are trying to do some short-term things like state size management to make Ethereum kind of more scalable and more usable in the short term, which is kind of the necessary. Then in the second stage, it's I expect like both chains will exist and people will kind of start migrating from one to the other when they feel comfortable, because there are a lot of benefits on being on a faster and sharded system with much lower fees and a 6-second block time. At the very beginning, I expect kind of data publishing type applications, so like things like these decentralized Twitters, to probably dominate ETH2 because they don't require much infrastructure, and then over time more and more complex smart contracts move over. Eventually, I expect ETH1 to kind of probably be subsumed into ETH2 either as a contract on top of it or something similar. Pete, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I kind of hope that we do a hard fork upgrade of L1 of the ETH 1.0 into ETH 2.0, and that we don't keep a kind of side thing going on. But I think that the approach of not disrupting the chain while we're improving the system, makes sense. I think we should test things and get people using them before we consider anything like a hard fork upgrade.
In such a way that if someone were to use the Ethereum 2 chain, or the Ethereum 2 chain in effect wouldn't risk users that want to stay on the first chain. Okay.
Maybe not for now.
Not for now, okay. Then, yeah, I guess I'll open it up to the audience. So, yeah.
Hi, so during the transition from 1.0 to 2.0, are you going to use 1.0 blocks as the candidate blocks for the 2.0 to finalize on, or so like how are you going to actually like do the transition from the POW chain into the POS chain?
Ooh, okay. So the way that this works in the current spec is that the validators on the 2.0 chain are also running a mechanism where they basically vote on which blocks on the 1.0 chain to finalize. And then once the 2.0 chain has finalized some block on the 1.0 chain, then anyone who deposited up before then will be able to provide Merkle proof receipt and join the 2.0 side. But this also has one positive side effect, which is that if a client developer wanted to, they could make a 1.0 client which kind of listens to and respects what 2.0 finalization as something that actually finalizes that block on the 1.0 chain. So once that happens, they will be kind of enacted. So 2.0 breaking will break 1.0 as well. But if that happens, then the main benefit that you have is that on the 1.0 side, you no longer need to rely heavily on the miners for security, and so you can cut issuance by a lot.
So if that's the way you're going to transition, LMD Ghost does not necessarily say anything about having a tie, how quickly you can resolve a tie until the odd number of votes coming. So what are the guarantees, like in the network assumptions or the number of votes that you have to have? Like what are the environmental properties that you need to make sure that every app will at least be able to justify one block?
Sure. So the kind of formal properties of FFG are basically that you need, in order to have safety, you need at least 2/3 to be honest, and in order to have liveness, you need 1/3 to be honest, and you also need network synchrony. Now, in terms of network synchrony, I think if we were to try to make a formal proof, we probably would be able to prove something like that it works if the network latency was lower than a few seconds, but we've also done simulations, and one of the really wonderful things about Ghost is that Ghost can actually be pretty stable even if the network latency is several times larger than the block time. And according to our simulations, it actually works fine and keeps finalizing stuff even if network latency goes up to something like 30 seconds. So.
Is that public? Is that simulation which all public?
Yeah, I think it's GitHub, Ethereum research, and /collect disparity.
Hi. So in terms of being able to talk about sharded consensus independently of data values, and then also just in general any kind of sharding for application layer concerns, given a resource that is necessarily shared across the entire ecosystem, or whatever we call all the chains running the network, which is namely Ethereum, right? I would ask two things. One, is there any plans to make Ethereum not be like in other words, be able to pay for gas in different currencies, like in stable coins or something like that? But two, I could do, once I'm on the new chain, I could do an airdrop to every Ethereum user in a single transaction, presuming I have the gas to do that. And doesn't that cause a single checkpoint that requires every shard in the system to synchronize on one transaction? My question is, how much do concerns about that kind of synchrony requirements impact thoughts about performance, thoughts about how you structure the data, or do they impact them at all?
Well, the main thing that it factors into is actually a discussion of gas limits and of how to make sure that you can't actually, do things that will slow down the whole system for really cheap. The point of gas is, one of the points of gas is denial of service protection. And these are really denial of service attacks that gas limits are meant to protect against. And so, it definitely is a performance concern, but it's also something that we have gas limits to deal with. And in terms of will gas be payable in other currencies, my personal preference is not in protocol. The protocol shouldn't support it. You can make smart contract solutions, or someone else packages your transaction and they get reimbursed. But the in protocol, gas should be paid in ETH.
To add to that answer in the context of the concrete spec that we're proposing, first of all, communication within a shard will be synchronous, but communication between shards will only be asynchronous. And so, like, you would do an airdrop, you could do an airdrop, but basically what you would really be doing is you would be creating a pile of Merkle receipts in each shard that the recipients or someone will at some point just have to pay the gas to kind of trigger on the other shards. So there won't be this kind of point of synchronization between different shards. As far as abstraction goes, I generally fully agree with Vlad that abstraction of gas fees is something that makes much more sense to do on layer 2 rather than layer 1. And I mean, for me, the reason why is that I think in order to mitigate proof-of-stake validator centralization, the job of being an optimal proof-of-stake validator cannot be too complex. And so if you require proof-of-stake validators to kind of have a lot of access to financial markets and like requiring them to solve multidimensional optimization problems, that starts to become more difficult to achieve. But on the other hand, I think you can get a lot of the benefits just with like layer 2 protocols where people do whatever they want in kind of off-chain messages. Off-chain messages pay fees to intermediaries, those intermediaries create transactions, and then they pay the Ether Bitcoin fees.
Goal, making, a given block have 2 pointers out, making mathematical proving easier and so forth. 1024 for shards sort of, I think, appeared in FFG, and it's still there now. And on the one hand, it's a really big number, but I mean, Bill Gates one time said 640K, I think, was more memory than anybody would ever need. So I'm just curious, do you feel like you have a feeling of, how optimal that choice is now as a first one, and then if it can be scaled over time, and what sort of impacts it would have? This is a longer term question, but just curious.
Sure. I personally be totally in favor of the 1024 shard count being forked upward eventually. There's reason, I mean, so far, like, I have not found anything close remotely approaching a kind of good, sensible governance algorithm for actually figuring out what the number should be in protocol. But other than, like the usual validator voting or whatever. But it's, like, in terms of what the optimum is, I think, like, starting with something lower makes, it makes sense. I mean, 1024 is high already, but starting with something lower makes sense from a safety point of view. And as the system grows and gets proven over time, then sure, it should go up and up and more.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this question touches a little bit on the load balancing Vlad has mentioned earlier for sharding. So I'm wondering, so far we are looking at shards which are static, so that they cover a fixed part of the state. So like shard 1, for instance, could contain state values A and B, and shard 2 could contain state values X and Y. So the question is it conceivable that I have dynamic sharding in the sense that each validator can pick what state values it's interested in? So just like that they are partially overlapping, but that there's no static shard?
I wouldn't let the validators pick, but this is the load balancer's responsibility in this kind of paradigm. The load balancer's responsibility is to move contracts around and to change the configuration of shards in order that the total gas consumption of the system is minimized, and so that the load is spread across the different shards. And definitely in this paradigm, the shard contract assignment is not fixed.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I had a question about burning the transition from ETH1 to the new chain. So this burning of the coins seems to designed to prevent duplicate for coins or airdrop code. But what happens as the ETH1 starts to get deserted and gets less secure? Sort of a reorg attack comes and gives back people their old coins, and everybody would be happy, and probably they would still go back to the same hard fork situation, which could have been at the very beginning just an airdrop.
So first of all, I don't expect, the economic value of the ETH1 token and ETH2 token we expect to be the same because it's all just ETH. So when you talk about the ETH1 chain being deserted, being deserted by users doesn't mean that the proof of work reward goes down, right? And we don't expect the only way the proof of work reward goes down is if we hard fork it down. And the only case in which it makes sense for us to hard fork it down is in the case where there is this kind of tight coupling where beacon chain finalization finalizes proof of work blocks, because then the ETH1 chain security doesn't depend entirely on proof of work. And if that happens, then 51% attacks on proof of work are not going to break safety in the way that you're talking about. But also, if we this is like the current kind of 1 to 2 conversion approach is not set in stone. So if we want to, we could aim for something more aggressive. So like we could do something where, for example, even in one of the earlier phases, we add a big field into the beacon chain that contains ETH1 transaction, and we come up with some separate mechanism for calculating stake roots. So like, if that is what people would want or will later decide makes sense, then there's like fairly simple ways to switch over to doing that.
Thank you.
Right, so given that the session is called the Future of Ethereum, I would be thinking it would be appropriate to talk about maybe the future of the Ethereum Foundation. So is its role, firstly about its role primarily with respect to the project management of Ethereum 2.0? Is it going to assume some more of a leadership position, or is it going to be more into funding and giving grants to teams building onto it? Because my understanding is that let's say that the subject matter expertise on the matter of sharding, proof of stake, and so on, it's quite limited.
Sure.
Right.
So first of all, like I think if we look at what's been happening currently, like most of the spec that we released yesterday has basically been written by 4 people: myself, Danny, Justin, and Shelley. So I don't think that I definitely don't think that we're veering on the side of like not enough technical leadership for the 2.0 roadmap at all. And like I think it's like that's totally the right trade-off to make. So like even Bitcoin, you know, it was entirely centrally planned by Satoshi until it was released. And so things that are kind of in the earlier stages when there's a lot of technical questions to be figured out, like the core developers are doing that, and over time, like especially as real things get built and start being used on the blockchain, more and more stakeholders naturally come in, and I think that's something we've seen on the 1.0 side, and that's something we'll definitely see on the 2.0 side once it launches and there's a lot of users. But right now, so far, I don't think that's a dimension in which we're kind of particularly failing.
Okay, and if I may ask, okay.
Going into 2019, other than fintech, what are the top 3 industries that would be embracing this Ethereum 2? And I can question this. When can we see the Ethereum back at 14 plus?
Where can we see what?
Ether back at 1400.
So I guess in terms of applications, I think finance is a big one. Outside of finance, I personally am excited about the very different suites of non-financial applications. So like I talked about, you know, certificate revocation, I talked about things like putting data on the blockchain to verify that it was published or that it was not, or that it's still valid until some point in time. As far as industries go, like gaming seems to be interesting, but that's, I mean, in the short term, I think plasma chains could be really good for that. Is like the area where sharding really shines, as opposed to things like plasma chains, is where you have applications that are more complex than just payments or payments in exchange. And then in the longer term, I expect to just see sort of more and more just regular random stuff that right now you would do on the internet. At least kind of cores of it become possible to partially do on blockchains as bigger scalability gets proven out. There's and as I mentioned, like all of these non-financial application areas are interesting, and things around like key revocation, around account management, just maintaining high value non-financial data. On the financial side, in like tokens and creating these kind kind of efficient open marketplaces where assets created by a lot of different people can easily interface with each other is also really useful. There's a lot of these applications that have to do with trying to create a sort of common data store so that companies in different industries can coordinate with each other without having to go through some central authority, and that's something that you totally can do on blockchains, but you need more scalability for.
Curious if you're considering long-running partitions in the order of months to years in the shard system, and if you're dealing with shards that might accelerate well beyond some different speeds. Some shards in small regions might be able to go drastically faster because latency is much smaller.
Yeah, great questions, and yeah, quick answer is yes. Having shards that can't talk to each other for a long time turns out to be a really great boon for scalability. If they only sync up infrequently, that creates less overhead. The heterogeneous sharding, where you have like different shards at different capacities, is definitely super interesting technology. However, it also introduces security concerns as people who maybe notice that one kind of shard is underserved can bring a lot of capacity on there and take over to attack those shards. And so there's a certain amount of liquidity that's required in the market for heterogeneous sharding for it to be secure. And so I would say it's not a sharding 1.0 thing. Neither of these are sharding 1.0 things.
I actually have a section in the sharding FAQ where I think I cite you as being excited about this sort of thing. My response was kind of no initially for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that it's complicated. The other is that if you start having shards where the kind of partitions have structure to them, so we talk about a San Francisco shard and a Toronto shard and a Europe shard or whatever, then the problem is that implies that nodes have a choice of which shards they're part of, which then implies that things like these 1% attacks that we solved with random sampling start to become a problem again. So I guess one question is like, to what extent do you specifically need base layer shards, or to what extent do you need light structures that kind of look like sharding in a really abstract sense, but aren't sharding TM, so like plasma chains, for example, make sense for that. Another question is, can we design sharded systems that kind of have support all of the different ranges of security? And that's definitely something we're interested in, but like, once again, Twitter trolls want us to ship, there has to be a chopping block, and like, that ended up on the right side.
I'm sorry, we're already 7 minutes over, so the next session, please thank our...
So there you have it, guys. That was Vitalik Butarin speaking at Stanford's blockchain conference. And wow, I first have to apologize. We missed the first 5 to 10 minutes. He started early. He was supposed to start at 3:30. He started early, so we missed a tiny bit. But from the gist of things, it sounds like we can expect some pretty big things coming out of Ethereum in the near future, guys. One being possibly a hard fork in maybe a year's time. I don't know how long this is going to take, but they're trying to do some pretty substantial changes with Ghost, which sounds a little bit different from Casper from how I understand it. So pretty interesting developments that they're working on. I'm happy to see good developments on Ethereum. In my personal opinion, the community behind Ethereum really represents a core demographic of the people that support blockchain technology as a whole. So I don't really want to see them go belly up, basically. It'd be a huge shame to the entire community of people that support blockchain technology. And that moving forward into the future is definitely something that'll be beneficial to everyone in the space. Anyways, guys, this is the Crypto Scout. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.